And I do love that he like tells of his conversion, because I think this is a good example for us, right? That like all that he went through
Yes.
was not for, just for him to keep to himself. It was used to show how God could change and transform, and the validity of who God is himself, and like to give God the glory and all of that. And so as much as like he could have been like, oh, I used to be a murderer, like I ain't gonna like tell them about that. Like he used even who he used to be to give God glory in his story. And like he used all parts of it.
Yo, welcome back to the Vibes Daily Podcast. It is day 320 of our year-long series we have titled Devoted, as we journey through the entire Bible from cover to cover, from Genesis to Revelation. You have joined us here in the book of Acts, and I am back again, joined by my wife, Victoria, as we powered through 28 chapters of this book.
Yeah.
This
like a marathon.
Yeah, it was quick. It was more like
a sprint. Actually.
Yeah, but like a sprint through mud and rain and something just really hard.
Yeah.
But got through a lot. Just it felt like it was, challenging to kind of take it all in and understand, right? Mm-hmm. Some of it. But here we are on the last day of the week to kind of have this final conversation. And we are ending here with essentially Paul's end of ministry and end of life. So we left off with him. He was headed to kind of go before different officials and whatnot in Rome, because the Jews had handed him over. They wanted to persecute him,
right?
Because of some things he had said. As we recall yesterday, he left off at, so I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And they're like, nope, unacceptable, have to go. So we pick up here in chapter 23. And again, he is going before these individuals. He has the opportunity to talk to the Sanhedrin specifically, right? So these religious leaders here in chapter 23, and try to make his case essentially, right? And there's this kind of whole thing with him talking to the high priest, and a little disrespectfully, but not really knowing he was talking to the high priest,
right?
Then he kind of, makes his case. I'm a Pharisee. I believe in the resurrection. That is what we believe as Pharisees, right? And then even throws that in to kind of cause some division.
Yeah.
Between the
like,
Pharisees
nice move.
real subtle way to turn them against each other. But yeah, what jumped out to you here at 23 as ultimately he's continuing to make his case for Jesus Christ before these religious leaders?
Yeah, I think it was interesting that like he was going in like, guys gonna strike you, whitewash wall, and he starts going, but then like Loki apologizes, and I'm just like, he really is backing up when he's saying at like verse 1, like, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. Like he's really trying to like back up, like I'm living what I preach. So like that he even just apologized and just says like, okay, the scriptures do say I need to respect you, so I'm going to respect you. Yeah. My apologies. And that's humble. That's humility. We don't see that often. But then also the next thing that stuck out to me was how he kind of like slipped in that he was a Pharisee to create this dissension, and like that they became like how this one issue was so divisive. Like they came unified. Yeah. Against Paul. Yeah. Then he says this one thing, and now they're fighting. Like they are like, it's getting violent.
Yeah, it actually got violent.
Yeah, it's like it's getting violent, and I'm like, wow, like talk about division, like division amongst God's people. That we just let an issue, a thought process, our belief in something that we hold that to like such high standard that like, okay, now all of a sudden like the other commandments are just getting thrown out, like right, like now we're not loving each other. Like now, like we're fighting, and I know they're trying to do it like in God's name, but yeah, no, that's not what he wants of us. Like he does not want us choking each other out in the temple. Like
yeah, definitely not over a doctrinal disagreement, essentially, right? So, but I think what I found interesting about it is there's a part of me that wonders if like Paul, it wasn't so much used as a way to like distract from him, which maybe it was just a good plea to get that, because again, some ended up on his side, right? Like there's a point they're like, yeah, some are like, well, what if a spirit or an angel had spoken to him, right? And so like some people were split as far as whether they believed in him, but I also wonder if it just kind of pointed out the inconsistencies in even their understanding, right? That like, let me just also point out that even among you all don't agree on this.
Yeah.
And so, and y'all coexist.
Yes. You're not trying to kill them. Well, kind of. But like, you're not trying to put them up on charges and have them handed over to the government to be killed. Like, if you guys can coexist and disagree, Paul and the Jews can coexist and disagree. But I think it more so was just like they felt threatened, right? Like they felt threatened because they were so many followers. Like people thought it was threatening to their like status, prestige, So yeah. But then I think it was interesting how the Lord speaks to him, right? That following night, and just tells him like, take courage. Like you have testified about me in Jerusalem, and now you must do it in Rome. And so it kind of gives this certainty that like, I do need to make it to Rome. Like, okay, I'll at least make it to Rome. That's where I'm going next. And I know that I'll make it regardless of what trials I go through. Yeah. Like I will make it there because God said so. That is necessary for me to get there. And so we see him. Like it was rough along the way that we'll see, but like God keeps him.
Yeah. And he always had that, and again, like I said, we'll get to it, but he always had that assurance and that promise. So even when it became rough, he knew like it wasn't the end, right? As we'll kind of see, because I gotta get to Rome, I gotta get before Caesar, as we'll eventually see, right? So like I said, to kind of continue this story, ultimately they kind of plot to kill him. They had a plan to ambush him. Essentially, they were going to bring him down to quote unquote interview him, and at that point would ambush him. But he has like a nephew.
Yeah, his nephew,
son of his sister. Kind of catches wind of this. So it's almost like he had an inside man there that could hear this story. And he tells the commander, and the commander kind of sneaks him out at nighttime, right, to make sure he doesn't they don't have that opportunity to do that. They take him before Felix, who's the governor, and he kind of makes his appeal to him as well. I mean, what do you think was interesting as he starts to become before these leaders like Felix, which kind of goes into 24 as well, and then I can't recall the guy's name that replaces Felix here later, but yeah, like what jumps out to you in this opportunity to go before these leaders?
Yeah, I think it was just this provision that I'm seeing here. Like, not only did he have this like inside man, right, but then they call, like, the centurions call for like 200 soldiers. Like, he has a whole like bodyguard situation.
It's like the president is coming into town.
Literally the escorts here.
For the escorts and Secret Service and helicopter oversight.
Top flight. It's top flight security up in here, guys. Like, it is like, and I'm just like, this is how you get ushered in. That is crazy. Like, as if you are a big deal. No, this is so crazy to me. And so he said, but protected. And I just see that as like the Lord's hand, that like he is continuously, and then he gets to stay in Herod's palace when he gets there. Like, it's guarded in Herod's palace. I mean, I know he ain't living. Like, he's still, I know that's where they be having dungeons and stuff.
Well, let's say, I mean, Herod's dead at this point. So it's kind of like a dead man's palace, but
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's a little creepy.
That's a little creepy,
in my opinion.
That's actually pretty creepy, but I mean, it might still have some gold in it, you know. It still might be a little blush. No, it's still creepy. It's creepy.
Yeah.
But yeah, but like, you know, he just gets taken there. And yeah, I think, like you said, I feel like along the way, just big picture, I feel like using your word, big picture, along the way, I do feel like God's just giving all of these rulers an opportunity, like an opportunity to see him, an opportunity to hear about him, an opportunity to accept Jesus, like an opportunity, you know, to lead as God's leader. But, you know, they kind of miss it here and there.
Well, I'm gonna kind of cheat here and use, because like these last few chapters, kind of in the inner acts, all kind of run together in some ways, right, in the story. So there's some themes, and I'm gonna kind of talk about, I think, two things that just jumped out, even as we're like right here. One is just the fulfillment of what Jesus promised, which was that his disciples would be before
kings
and government officials and all sorts of stuff. And like you just see that again, whether it's Felix, whether it's eventually Caesar, whether it's like all these individuals that Paul gets the opportunity to preach the gospel to, is some of it is just, to me, what stuck out was like, oh, this is exactly what Jesus promised.
Yes.
This is what he said would happen. And so to just see that was so interesting. But the other side of it, I kind of felt challenged to, I'm not trying to be a lawyer by any stretch of imagination, but also like, know my rights.
Yeah.
Like a lot of how Paul got out of, like, or got even before, because to be clear, he wasn't trying to really get out of prison or get out of trouble.
Yeah.
He was determined to get before Caesar because he felt like God called him to be before Caesar and to give him a chance. But a lot of how he navigated this whole piece was because he understood the law.
Yeah.
Like, and by the law, I don't mean the Jewish law. I mean, he understood the Roman law, like the government structures, right? So he knew that as a citizen, he had a right to appeal before Caesar. He knew as a citizen that, like, just because they had a religious disagreement didn't mean the Jews had any right to kill him, right? Like, he knew that they had to give him an opportunity to stand before his accusers, right? Like, these were some of the laws of the land, and he understood them well enough to navigate them, and use that ultimately, again, for spreading the gospel, to get the gospel to as many places as he could. Because as we'll see over and over again, he just continues to just preach his story. He just continues to preach his story every time he gets a chance to get before somebody. And so I think it really challenged me, as much as, like, again, I had conversations on this podcast about, you know, politics and things of that nature. I do think it's like, all right, still know the laws of my land, like understand enough to know, like, all right, what can I do, you know, legally? What rights do I have as a church or a Christian nonprofit, or as a citizen, or as a neighbor, or in my HOA, or as whatever, right? Like, know enough about those things to be able to navigate, again, for the purpose of spreading his gospel. So that it is unhindered, you know, in those different ways. So I just thought it was interesting. The more you keep reading, it just feels like Paul just understood his rights. Like, he just knew what was offered to him as a Roman citizen.
Yeah, definitely. No, and I think it was so interesting, though, like, to your first point of them being able to be in front of, like, kings and stuff. I think it's really interesting that these kings are familiar already with what's happening. So when he goes before Felix in verse 22, so, but Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, like, put them off, right? And so it's like they had knowledge. And when he gets to King Agrippa, you know, he says to him in verse 3, especially because you are familiar with the customs and controversies of the Jews, therefore I beg you to listen to me patiently. Yeah. And so it's like these kings, it seems like they were even given a precursor to Paul eventually coming and standing before them and offering them this gospel of the way, right? Yeah. That, like, even God, as he's making this promise and Jesus is speaking these words of, like, you'll be before kings and stuff, that, like, God was already orchestrating and prompting them and opening their ears. Because I'm just like, who is really paying attention to so much to these Jewish religious customs and controversies and stuff like that? Like, I know they needed to know the things that are happening in their land, but, like, they weren't a boastful people like that, right? Like, they were being ruled. I guess you gotta understand what's happening. But yeah, overall, I was like, why would the king just know so much? Like, but also they were living in times where, like, people just wanted to know what's the newest religion? What's the newest this? What's the newest that?
Yeah.
That we saw a lot of that just needed to be in the know,
Yeah. Well, and I think it's two things that we kind of know historically, right? From other writings and stuff that take or that reference this time period, outside of the Bible. I think there's two things that probably speak to why they were so aware. Number one, again, this was a movement. Like thousands of people are following this thing.
Right.
And you even think about the way Jesus's ministry was, where thousands of people are listening to him preach. Like anytime there were huge crowds and stuff like that, like these governments, officials, or the governors, the kings, the whomever you wanted to, the tetrarchs, like all these different positions, they had to be aware of what was happening in their place, right? So they're going to want to know about that. But even beyond that, one of the things that like the writings point out is that these Christians, these Christ followers, the people of the way, the disciples of Jesus, were making such an impact in their communities, right? Like I can't recall, but I read this in, Can We Trust the Gospels, where they were like, there was a specific writer that pointed out that the Christians were taking better care of the citizens of Rome than even the government officials were, right? So like as far as people being fed or the sick being treated and dealt with, or whatever the case may be, like Christians would often go to places to care for the needy in a way that was even the government officials weren't doing well. So they were very much aware, like, yo, who is this group of people that is taking such good care of our citizens? And so I do think they were very aware because one, they had grown in numbers, and two, because they were known for the way they were loving their neighbors. Yeah. Right? And the way that they were loving their community.
By this, they will know that you are my disciples.
Like, legitimate.
That you love. Come on.
Directly. So, like, I don't know. I think that is a lot of what they were aware of. But yeah, so you can, as you said, to your point, it had reached the ears of Felix. It had reached the ears of Caesar. It reached the ears of Agrippa. It had reached the ears of these individuals to where they were very much aware of this movement and what was happening. And, probably contrast that with the Jews. They probably were like, we don't have those stories about the Jewish people. It's not like the Jewish people out here loving their neighbors well. This group, this sect, as they called them, was unique.
I think the Chosen does a good job of even like putting that like context into like a visual application, because you will see like the Roman soldiers and stuff and the governors like trying to control crowds, or who are these people and what's happening, and interviewing people. So that is like a good visual of what could have been happening at that time. Yeah. Essentially.
So let's talk about some other things that might have stuck out to us in this section. End of 24, that was really interesting. First, that Felix's wife was Jewish. I just thought it was an interesting fact, right? And maybe also offered some of why some of this mattered or he was aware of. But I just thought, how it's such a politician, man. He's over here trying to, hope Paul will grease his pockets and bribe him and pay him off to get released. And so he just kind of keeps coming back to him, just waiting for Paul to try to bribe him.
It's so crazy.
Yeah. And so he's there straight 2 years, that he's kind of under that until, Porcius Festus succeeds him and whatnot. And so, yeah, I mean, he leaves him there, and then Festus kind of shows up and is like, wait, who's this Paul guy I'm in charge of real quick? And tries to figure out what to do with him, essentially. But he's already appealed to Caesar at this point, so we know he has to go before Caesar. That's kind of how that handled. And like you said, that's when Agrippa comes to visit Festus, Agrippa and his and Bernice. And I don't know, like you said, that whole, they explain the story to him. He gets to explain the story. Paul gets to tell Agrippa and them like who he is and tell his story all over again. And as he said, they kind of come away from it like, man, he's blameless. And honestly, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we should probably let him go. We could let him go.
Exactly.
But yeah, what else? Anything else jump out to you kind of in 25, 26? Just kind of this section as he's continuing to go before these leaders.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that, they just didn't think it was egregious, right? That they were just like, I would have thought if you were appealing for him to be killed that like maybe some real evils here, but like it's not. It's not that serious. And so, yeah, but Paul later on even just explains that, like, because the Jews opposed letting him go, that like he had to appeal to Caesar in that moment. And so yeah, so like he's on his way. And I do love that he like tells of his conversion, because I think this is a good example for us, right? That like all that he went through
Yes.
was not for, just for him to keep to himself. It was used to show how God could change and transform, and the validity of who God is himself, and like to give God the glory and all of that. And so as much as like he could have been like, oh, I used to be a murderer, like I ain't gonna like tell them about that. Like he used even who he used to be to give God glory in his story, and like he used all parts of it and continued to go back to it.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say, I think that's why you'll hear it told or taught in some churches that like evangelism is as simple as just telling your story. Just tell people what God did for you, like what your life was. And I think we've had this conversation. It's why I have felt, particularly over maybe the last year or so much more challenged to be more clear about like our move to South Carolina, right? And like again, that's not when my faith walk started, but like people, it's one of the questions that comes up more often than anything else, right? Since we've been out here, because we moved from California all the way across the country, one of the first questions that come up all the time is, why did you move? What brought you here? Was it for work? Was it whatever? And that story is nothing but a God story, right? Like as far as how we got here, why we're here, how we got here, and what he has done since we've been here has been nothing but the Lord. But I'll, again, confess it's been a challenge to me to feel like they don't want to hear all that. Like that's not why that's not what they were asking. They weren't opening up the door for me to tell them about Jesus. They were just curious if I came out here for work. For them, it was just like I think about back to the disciple who pointed out the temple, right? Like, oh, the temple looks nice, Jesus. And then he gives them this whole prophecy of the end times. And it's like, I didn't know it was going to be all that. I was just trying to observe the architecture. Like, I feel like that's how this question is to me. It's just posed to me. It's just like I'm just curious why you moved out here, and don't always feel like it's an invitation to just give you my faith. But I feel challenged. Like, how do I tell that story in such a way that still gives God the glory and walks through that open door that could potentially, draw us into a conversation about faith? Because that's what it should be. Every conversation I have should be an opportunity to point them to Jesus. Yeah. Right? Like every day that should be my goal. And I feel like that was Paul's goal. Whether he was in prison with Silas, whether he's on the boat, as we'll get to later, on the ship, whether he's on the island, whether he's in the jail, no matter where Paul was trying to tell people about Jesus. Yes. Like, and like you said, and he often did it just by telling his own story. Yeah, that's where he started. Like, he often started there. Yeah. And then we could get into more of the doctrine and, what we believe and what this means for us now together. Now I can teach and walk with you. Yeah. But first, let me tell you my story. Yeah. And like you said, to your point of our story, that very first line, like the answer is like, oh, well, God gave me a dream. Like there's no getting around that. Like there is no sugarcoating that or getting around it. So I think it's essential and like it's necessary. Yeah. So I do love that point that out. So thanks for bringing that up. But like I said, he makes his case. I think it's really interesting though that Luke is still saying we here. That like he's back in this. Yes. With them through this part, which is interesting. Why I think he kind of gave more detail at one point when he actually tells his story about like this Damascus road. Are we there yet? I don't know if we're there yet. I think so. Yeah, this like Damascus road encounter. There's like a few extra like lines here, which I was like, oh, there's more detail on what the Lord told him when he was on this Damascus road here. It's probably because Luke heard it himself and is like actively recording, right? Versus previously, the story is just told to him because he wasn't there on the Damascus road. He wasn't there in some of the first places that Paul was where he's explaining this story, right? And so that was probably the truncated version. Yeah. It is interesting. But I did was to say I was going to point out that as much as we said Luke wasn't in any of these, he wasn't arrested with Paul any of those times. He does get shipwrecked with Paul.
He sure does.
He's on the ship with him, and he's on his way to Rome with him, and he gets shipwrecked with him. Because when we get to that whole section, all that's written in the we.
Is we.
Kind of through that. So, yeah. So 26, like you said, ultimately, kind of Festus and Agrippa and them, they kind of hear him, but aren't necessarily convinced. I mean, they actually call him crazy. Agrippa calls him crazy. It's just like, Festus calls him crazy. He's like, you are out of your mind. You've been studying too much.
Yeah.
You have overthought this, right? You were just way too deep in this. And, then he was trying to convert Agrippa. Agrippa's like, you think you're just gonna convince me that easily to become a Christian? He's like, hey man, I wish. It's worth a shot. I'm gonna shoot my shot.
Listen.
But yeah, and then I love that verse though, because he's like, this is 29. I wish before God, replied Paul, that whether easily or with difficulty, not only you, but all who listen to me today might become as I am. And shout out to Paul, because he said, except for these chains. Praise you, Paul. Thank you, brother, for not wishing them chains on me.
On me.
Wish that I would know God that same way, but not wishing that on me. I was like, I appreciate you. But yeah, so ultimately, man, he gets the 27. They set sail for Rome. And they're on this ship. And yeah, like he tries to get some advice, tries to say, hey, we probably shouldn't go. They don't listen. They end up in a storm, a northeaster, as it's referred to here. That storm ultimately shipwrecks them. I mean, talk to me about 27, 28. Like, what jumped out to you as they are on this path to Caesar and to Rome?
I think one of the things that jumped out was just how this wind dictated where they went or where they could go, where they didn't go, right? And I mean, as a person who is a sailor, like, you just rely on the wind, right? But I just think, like, wow, like, Holy Spirit, like, what
to an extent, like,
right, like,
well, and I will call out, reading this, I was like, I am not a sailor, because I don't know half of these terms y'all are using. Like, they were writing this like we sail, like we have a boat, and
like I was on the water yesterday.
Yeah, I didn't know half of the like terms they were using and stuff. But I think as much as you're like, yeah, you are kind of at the mercy of the wind, you're not exactly, if you know what you're doing, because from your, obviously you have oars and you have other things, and you know how to manipulate the sail in such a way that it will use the wind to go the direction you want to go, right? But to your point, they get to the point where they don't have oars anymore. They don't have an anchor. They literally are at the mercy of wherever the wind will take them at that point. So, like, yeah, like, usually that's not the case with a ship. But for these, like, at this point, because they had to throw everything away, they are at this point where, like, yeah, absolutely at the mercy of the wind. And I think that was crazy. And like, all I could think of was Judah's song, Wind of Love. It was like, and I put myself in the air.
That Joel Barnes, it slapped though. That Wind of Love it's a good one.
But like, that's the image I have. Is I just put myself in the air.
Yeah,
and I'm yours. Just take me anywhere, wherever you go. Like, I'm gonna follow. And that it really was at the mercy of the Lord and wherever He took them. So yeah, I agree with you. I thought that was interesting to see that they got to that point for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'll say that I think for me, the other thing that stuck out to me was 27 verse 24, chapter 27 verse 24, because, this angel comes to him in the middle of the night and he tells him, don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar. And indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you, right? So he comes out with this like confidence of, hey, don't worry about it. We're all going to survive this. We're going to lose the ship, but the people will survive because God has told me that I have to be in, before Caesar.
Yes.
Which, he keeps using that phrase, it is necessary. Like, he uses that phrase a lot in the writing that, like, this has to happen this way. And so there's this assurance for him. But I think what stuck out to me was, essentially, it feels like the rest of their lives are spared because of Paul.
Absolutely. That's what it looks like to me.
Like, it's because Paul's on this ship and he has something destined for Paul to do before Caesar, that he spares the rest of their life.
Yep.
Right. And I thought that was so, like, I don't know, just the image of just thinking like how many people are saved or spared simply because of their proximity to, you know, the one that God chose, like, and kind of direct it, and like just being close enough to those people sometimes can, there'll be some grace and some mercy, you know, on us as well. So
That's awesome.
that stuck out to me. But anything else that jumped out to you in 27?
As we're journeying through, I think all I can think about is one of my favorite, like, apologetic, like, things about the Bible. Did I say apologetic? Apologetic.
I don't know what you said, but I knew what you meant.
Oh, so I think one of the things that just stuck out was just all these places, like the names, right? Like, not only the names of like where they were pushed to, like, I'm sure if we did like a study, which people have, right? Done a study of like these locations and some of their like more ancient names that they probably don't go by now, but you would find all these people and all these places, and then when it's talking about the wind pushing, like, and you ended up there, it's like, oh yeah, you ended up there. And so I think that was interesting to me. And then just also all, like you said, you mentioned before, the terminology of the boats and stuff.
Yeah,
like they were really on a boat, like, because they have all these different things that they're talking about.
Yeah,
as if you knew exactly what was happening on this ship. Yeah. And so that was, because for me, I couldn't make up all this stuff. Like,
yeah, like I said, because I mean, we don't spend any time on boats. At least not really. I don't.
But the vast variety of like people and kings that are mentioned in history books, other history books, right? Not even the Bible. To locations, to
there are so many ways that just like to date and to like accurately describe what's happening, that like you said, it would be really hard to make this up, make up all of the points of reference that are used as details to accurately depict what's going on, right? So which again, there's not a lot of, I will say there's not a lot of debate on whether like Paul lived. Right. Because again, it's just too much evidence. Yes. There, you know, and again, he does go before Caesar and some other people, right? Like, it's really hard. I think, and you know, we'll talk about this in a different time, kind of some of the apologetic stuff as a whole, but I do think where it encourages me is goes, okay, if this is true and what Paul says he believed, like, that's what you know, right? He says these things and he believed these things, then like that is the part that gives me some assurance, like, okay, he believed it so much so that he endured all these things that he endured, and, you know, kind of pressed forward, that like, yeah, man, like maybe we should pay attention to what this guy had to say. So yeah, but end up shipwrecked in Malta. It's kind of where they end up, ashore, and that community showed them some kindness and took care of them, and he took care of them. He gets bitten by a snake and doesn't die. Yeah. But yeah, he's healing people as well that are sick, and ultimately, eventually they get the opportunity to finally set sail, go to Rome. He gets there, gets to get before some Jewish leaders again, kind of answer some questions and share his story even further. Some believe, some don't, you know, kind of thing. And we kind of get left with him on house arrest, just kind of waiting for what we ultimately will know will be his I won't say assassination, but his death, which will come. But yeah, I don't know, what jumped out to you here in chapter 28?
Yeah, I just, this favor, right? This favor that, like, even along the way, I mentioned this earlier at the beginning of this episode, of like God just giving people opportunities to meet him. And so here you say, like you said, and like this whole island kind of just gets this opportunity to meet who Jesus is, right? And experience healing and deliverance, right? Like, and because they're on an island, like, there's probably not a whole lot of people going to and from them, right? They are like super isolated in their sicknesses, isolated, like, with no really access to a whole bunch of other specialists or whoever, you know? So they are really like isolated out there. So like the fact that God has intentionally brought call to them to stop there. Like, he couldn't have let them go on any of those harbors that they were trying to go on, but like, he intentionally let him stop there and to care for these people and to bring salvation. And like, they've been saying this whole time, hey, you Jews might not accept it, but these Gentiles sure will with gladness. And so I think that was just interesting to me. But then, of course, this favor that is just continuously on Paul. Like, he gets bit by a snake. They expect him to just swell up and die, and they just look and you know, he doesn't. And then to the fact that he gets to stay on his own with his bodyguard, essentially, right? Like, this soldier, like, who's not stressing on him because this whole time he's been looking out for him, right? And so he gets to live on his own, and people get to come and go and see him, and he still gets to preach and teach. And so he's providing for, at this point, the Roman government is funding like his ministry, like at least his provisions, right? Like, I'm sure they're taking care of his provisions. And so it was just sweet to see God just using him and caring for him, even in the midst of like the trials.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Like, it almost feels like, I don't say he's in retirement, but like
yeah.
He was almost in retirement and just sitting there. You were joking, you know, yesterday, like on his wraparound porch and his rocking chair, just telling stories of the good old days of you know, when Jesus saved him, and just kind of coming. And the things that just stuck out was, again, like you said, that some believed, some did not. Right. Some were persuaded, some did not. And he kind of calls out, Isaiah said this is exactly what would happen. So, you know, this is not a surprise. There's a part of me that just wonders, like, why the Gentiles were so much more willing to believe than the Jews. Like, what was it about? Was it that because they were just the Jews were so tied to that law that they had elevated it to such a level that, like, I don't know, that they just, I don't know what that conflict was for some of them to not actually expect this Messiah to come, and not want to receive Jesus as that Messiah. But and why the Gentiles were so much more willing, like, especially when, I mean, they had their own gods, right? It's not like the Gentiles were just these godless people that didn't believe in religion. They were often religious, you know, whether it was Zeus and Hermes, we talked about earlier, they thought Paul and Barnabas were, or whatever the case may have been. Like, I don't know. It's just very interesting to me, again, like, why that's the case, but it did stick out to me that was said. And then the last thing for me was just, you know, it ends with this fact that, you know, he had been proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. And I just thought that thing was hilarious to me, because I'm like, he's literally on house arrest. Like, how is he unhindered?
Right.
Like, how are there no hindrances? Like, if there are no hindrances, you could just get up and go, like, where you want to go. But he is stuck, you know, there. But just the fact that ultimately he could speak freely and profess to anybody who would come from him, I guess to him was the same as being unhindered. And I think, like, it does challenge me to just think to myself of, like, what are the excuses I give, you know, or the things that I say, like, are hindering me from doing these things, right? When it's like, well, if I have the freedom to speak, I'm unhindered, right? I even go back to the story I just shared of, like, okay, if somebody invited me to tell that story, there's nothing preventing me from telling that story. Nothing but myself and what I only think, right? And so I think that's kind of the thing that I just thought of, was just like, it's, to me, it looks like a hindrance. You're on house arrest. Like, if I was in jail, I might have given up myself. Like, well, my ministry's done. I'm locked up. So,
I'm
you
still
know,
taking that.
Yeah, but he still felt free and unhindered because he was able to continue to tell the gospel story to anybody who came by and visited. So I just thought it was interesting to me.
So good. Love it. Well, that's a wrap.
All right. That is it for the book of Acts. Man, there's a lot there. I know it was a lot this week worth of reading, but hopefully, again, this was insightful, and reading it together hopefully helped versus kind of breaking it up over a couple weeks. But if you have thoughts, questions, feedback, please join our chat groups in our Vibes Church app and share your thoughts there in the Vibes Daily group. But we appreciate you joining us. Come back and see us next week as we pick up the book of Romans and continue to actually hear more from Paul, who we will hear kind of over the next few weeks from his letters, Romans and Corinthians and Philippians and Galatians and Ephesians, all those come from his teaching. So not quite done with Paul yet.
Not at all.
We are, but appreciate you guys joining us this week. Until next time, take care.
Thank you for joining us for the Vibes Daily Podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or download our favorite, the Vibes Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the Bible. Take good care.